Hi everybody, most of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Micah McConnaughey, and for my SCE I chose to do short fiction stories that actually focused on monsters from mythology. For as long as I can remember, I have been a fan of horror. I can remember sitting in my house watching John Carpenter's Halloween when I was 10. Bad idea, but I enjoyed it. I can remember begging to watch Nightmare on Elm Street. Also a bad idea, did not enjoy that. 2 weeks of nightmares as a whole. That's a whole thing. But I kept coming back to it. Horror seems to be viewed as the less than genre. When I told people like what I was working on, you would be surprised about how many of the hidden eye rolls I got. I was like, fair enough, because there's a lot of bad horror stories out there. Like, just go to the movie theater, I mean, like, honestly. But I don't feel like it is the less than genre. I feel like it invokes primal fears that a lot of us will never have to face in our day-to-day lives. I mean, we're a pretty sheltered, like, species. I mean, basically top of the food chain. Unless you're with sharks, but that's a whole other thing. To me, horror is the adrenaline junkie genre. But it's more interesting than that. I actually, when I was about in 6th grade, I used to write horror stories starring me and my friends. To be fair, most of them were plagiarized and basically just plots of horror movies I watched, but I never published them, so it's okay. Since then, I've always wanted to write horror. I've always wanted to be able to write stories that invoked the same emotions that those movies would get out of me. And when I was trying to decide my SCE project, I actually got an interest in mythological creatures from the past and more recent ones because I realized how they represented a culture's fears. For example, there's a creature called the Adzi in African mythology, and it's found in Togo and Ghana. And it is basically a vampire, but the signs that the beast has fed on somebody are actually the same symptoms as malaria, with the victim often falling ill and dying. And to me, I thought it was really interesting that this culture basically created this creature as a way to explain something they didn't understand and that scared them. And I thought it was really, really interesting to see how these things would, how these creatures and how these ideas would be formed just from fear. For my process, I actually spent countless nights searching for mythical creatures that I thought were interesting and that were less known than basically vampires and werewolves, because everybody knows those. Those stories have been beaten to the ground. Then after I would find them, I would spend my nights searching for credible sources that talked about these creatures in their original context, which is a lot harder than it sounds. You'd be surprised. And the reason I mentioned original context is because I didn't want to twist the creatures to fit my stories. A lot of forms of media do this, like the show Supernatural and Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. And there's nothing wrong with that, I just didn't want to do it. For example, an example of this twisting is, when I say vampires, most of us probably think of Twilight or Dracula, the dark, brooding, pale, has fangs. Interestingly enough, vampires have never been said to have fangs like in the original lore. They actually don't have pale skin. Their skin is primarily more purple, like there's been a lack of oxygen. And they're generally bloated, kind of looking like they've been in water. So I don't know if you would want to date one at your high school. There's nothing wrong with changing these creatures. They're fiction, you know? They represent a culture's fear, and changing them helps continue this theme of fitting our society's fears. But for me, I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to showcase these creatures as what they were, rather than what we've changed them to be. Originally, when I first got here, like when we first came back and we actually started meeting, I had about 80 pages of just names. I'm talking just names, 12 font, 80 pages. So I obviously had to cut it down because, one thing, each story has ended up being about 7 to 9 pages. I don't have the patience or the time to do that all in one semester. So I cut it down to about 5 because I found that 5 seemed to be a good number for me to make a small story arc for this project that I could expand upon if I wanted to afterwards. The story follows an unnamed, ungendered narrator that is propelled to action by something happening to their son. The stories are kind of like a journal, less like a field guide, but somewhere in the middle. But the stories basically follow the narrator as they interact with the creatures or interview people that have interacted with the creatures, like I'm in the portion of my second story that I'm going to read to you. In this second story, the narrator travels to Tipton, Indiana, a real town, by the way, to interview a stay-at-home mom who has encountered a more modern mythological creature known as the Black-Eyed Children. So I'm going to go ahead and read this for you. Through a friend of a friend sort of deal, I met a woman named Katie Merrill. Through email, I arranged an interview, agreeing to meet at her home in Tipton, Indiana. Mrs. Merrill still lives in the same house where she encountered the Black-Eyed Children back in 1994. Tipton is a tiny town, having only about 5,000 to 6,000 people. It gave off a somber feeling as I drove through the downtown area. Closed shops on my left and right. And in the past, if a town was doing poorly, it would be attributed to a curse or to witchcraft. Now we just view it as commonplace. A dying town is the norm for America. Skipping into the interview, Katie Merrill came back from her off-trail thought and continued. Where was I? Oh yeah, Mikey, her son, an infant at the time. Mikey had been coughing all day. I couldn't even get him down for his nap, so I definitely didn't want to wake him up now. This was around 1 a.m.? Yes, 1 a.m. because I remember telling myself I was going to feel awful the next morning. I'm sure you've done the same. I'm not a night owl like Randall. Oh, Randall is my husband. He's a truck driver. Randall thought that Mikey would be fine, that the cough would pass, and that I should stop worrying. He says I worry too much, but how could I just ignore Mikey when he sounded like he was coughing up a lung? So I stayed up with the baby and watched the movie Sister Act. It was getting to the end, I think. I've never actually gotten to finish the movie, when there was a knock on the door. A knock? I asked. She continued, yeah, a knock. Of course I'm thinking, who the heck knocks on a door at 1 a.m.? We're not a big town, as you can tell, and most people would have called if they needed me, even at that hour. So while getting visitors isn't weird, everything else about that night was. To be honest, I thought about just ignoring it, pretending like somebody left the TV on. I'm sure you've done that too when someone comes to your door that you weren't expecting, and I really wish I had. So I laid Mikey down on the couch and peeked out the curtains, hoping to get a look at who was standing there. I don't know if I was more scared or relieved to see the silhouette of 2 kids standing on my porch at 1 a.m. Our porch light hadn't been working for a week or 2. Randall always said he was going to fix it and told me not to call an electrician, but when he would finally get home, he was always too tired. She seemed to get off topic a lot, but it made me smile. Anyways, I moved to the door and I opened it, and I could get a better look at the 2 kids. One was a little boy, probably around 4, 5. I think he was 4, but there's no way of telling. And the other was an older girl, probably around 7. They were staring at the ground, almost like someone would when they were in trouble. The boy was wearing jeans and a sweater. The girl was wearing a dress that looked like something somebody would wear to church, almost like a sundress. They were actually pretty nice clothes, you know? They didn't look homeless, which eliminated a possibility in my mind. So these kids are just standing there, staring at my feet for a few seconds before the girl speaks. We're lost and we can't find our home. Can we come in and use your phone? The thing is, normally I would have moved over and got them inside, but the way she asked, it was like there was no emotion in her voice. Kids don't hide their feelings. If they're sad, they cry. If they're angry, they, well, cry. And if they're scared, they scream or cry or do something. But these kids just stood there. They just stood there and stared at the ground. Honestly, just the little girl's voice gave me goose pimples. If Mikey hadn't been there, I might have just taken the risk and let them inside. I'm not strong, but 2 kids didn't scare me. It's not like they could overpower me. What are they going to do, beat me with Mega Blocks? So I asked, what are your last names? Maybe I can call your parents for you. The little girl just repeated, can we come in and use your phone? Well, that didn't work, so instead I asked, What street do you live on? This time, the boy spoke up for the first time. Can we come in and use your phone? It was like they were reading off a script or something. Well, if you tell me where you live, I could. They didn't even let me finish, repeating in unison. Can we come in and use your phone? Mrs. Merrill continued. At that point, I felt terrified. Not like you get when you feel something crawling up your leg, or when you're closing the fridge door and you expect something to be standing on the other side. It was the fear that my life was in danger, that Mikey's life was in danger. I told them, I'll call the police for you and they can help, okay? If the kids had been put up to this, they would have probably bolted, right? I mean, they wouldn't want to get in trouble with the police. At least that made sense to me. But they didn't even move. They just asked again, can we come in and use your phone? At that point, the conversation must have been loud enough to wake up Mikey because his coughing started up again. I only turned my head to look at him, only for a second. It was only for a second, and when I looked back, both were staring at me. Their eyes were pitch black. They were pitch black, and I know it wasn't the lighting. Everyone keeps saying that, but I know it wasn't the trick of the light. Their eyes were pitch black, like coal or ink, and I was frozen with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, and couldn't scream. I just stared, and they stared back at me with those emotionless faces. Then the girl uttered something that sprung me into action. Can we come in and see the baby? Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
A couple of the other essays have dealt with creative writing in the audio form. Have you considered turning any of this into a podcast or submitting it to something that was audio stored?
I actually thought about that about a week ago. I was like, I should have done this as a podcast. And then I was like, I'm definitely not going to try to figure out all those programs right now. But I actually have considered it, and my brother actually called me today to tell me, because he knew I was working on this project, there's actually a podcast out called Lore right now. Okay. Which I had never heard of. But he said that tons of people are talking about it, and as much as they don't like who's narrating it, they say that he doesn't do a very good job. It shows that there's, you like him? Okay. No offense, but that there's obviously an audience for it. So that kind of piqued my interest too. But at this point, I wouldn't want to like step on Laura's toes. So it's a possible.